Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to be reading the rest of Esio Trot. We are going to be starting on page 26. Let's begin. Before he retired, Mr. Hoppy had been a mechanic in a bus garage, and now he went back to his old place of work and asked his mates if he might use his old bench for an hour or two. What he had to do now was to make something that would reach down from his own balcony to Mrs. Silva's balcony and pick up a tortoise. This was not difficult for a mechanic like Mr. Hoppy. First, he made two metal claws or fingers, and these he attached to the end of a long metal tube. He ran two stiff wires down inside the tube and connected them to the metal claws in such a way that when you pulled the wires, the claws closed, and when you pushed them, the claws opened. The wires were joined to a handle at the other end of the tube. It was all very simple. Mr. Hoppy was ready to begin. Mrs. Silva had a part-time job. She worked from noon until 5 o'clock every weekday afternoon in a shop that sold newspapers and sweets. That made things a lot easier for Mr. Hoppy. So on that first excited afternoon, after he had made sure that Mrs. Silva has gone to work, Mr. Hoppy went out on his balcony. Armed with his long metal pole, he called this his tortoise catcher. He leaned over the balcony railings and lowered the pole down on Mrs. Silva's balcony below. Alfie was basking in the pale sunlight over to one side. "Hello, Alfie," Mr. Hoppy said. "You are about to have to go for a little ride." He wiggled the tortoise catcher till it was right above Alfie. He pushed the hand lever so that the claws opened wide. Then he lowered the two claws neatly over Alfie's shell, and pulled the lever. The claws closed tightly over the shell like two fingers of a hand. He hauled Alfie up onto his own balcony. It was easy. Mr. Hoppy weighed Alfie on his own kitchen scales just to make sure that Mrs. Silva's figure of 13 ounces was correct. It was. Now, holding Alfie in one hand, he picked his way carefully through his huge collection of tortoises to find one that first of all had the same color shell of Alfie's, and secondly weighed exactly 2 ounces more. 2 ounces is not much. It is less than a smallish hen's egg weighs. But you see, the important thing in Mr. Hoppy's plan was to make sure that the new tortoise was bigger than Alfie, but only a tiny bit bigger. The difference had to be so small that Mrs. Silva wouldn't notice it. From his vast collection, it was not difficult for Mr. Hoppy to find just the tortoise he wanted. He wanted one that weighed 15 ounces exactly on his kitchen scales, no more, no less. When he had got it, he put it on the kitchen table beside Alfie, and even he could hardly tell that one was bigger than the other. But it was bigger. It was bigger by 2 ounces. This was tortoise number 2. Mr. Hoppy took tortoise number 2 out onto the balcony and gripped it in the claws of his tortoise catcher. Then he lowered it onto Mrs. Silva's balcony right beside a nice fresh lettuce. Tortoise number 2 had never eaten tender juicy cabbage leaves. It loved the lettuce and started chomping away at it with great gusto. There followed a rather nervous 2 hours wait for Mrs. Silva to return from work. Would she see any difference between the new tortoise, said Alfie. It was going to be a tense moment. Out onto her balcony swept Mrs. Silva. Alfie, my darling, she cried out, Mummy's back. Have you missed me? Mr. Hoppy peered over his railing, but well hidden between 2 huge potted plants, held his breath. The new tortoise was still chomping away at the lettuce. My, Alfie, you do seem hungry today, Mrs. Silva was saying. It must be Mr. Hoppy's magic words I've been whispering to you. Mr. Hoppy watched as Mrs. Silva picked the tortoise up and stroked his shell. Then she fished Mr. Hoppy's piece of paper out of her pocket, and holding the tortoise very close to her face, she whispered, reading from the paper. Esio Trot, take regib, imog no Esio Trot, wag puff, fup, pa, tooths pa, knurps pa, wolb pa, lose pa, agrog, elzug, fats, plug, tup no taff, Esio Trot, tup no taff, teg no, elbog, doof. Mr. Hoppy popped his head out of the foliage and called out, Good evening, Mrs. Silva. How is Alfie tonight? Oh, he's lovely, Mrs. Silva. Oh, he's lovely, Mrs. Silva said, looking up and beaming, and he's developing such an appetite. I've never seen him eat like this before. It must be the magic words. You never know, Mr. Hoppy said darkly. You never know. Mr. Hoppy waited 7 whole days before he made his next move. On the afternoon of 7th day, when Mrs. Silva was at work, he lifted tortoise number 2 from the balcony below and brought it into his living room. Number 2 had weighed exactly 15 ounces. He must now find one that weighed exactly 17 ounces, 2 ounces more. From his enormous collection, he easily found a 17-ounce tortoise, and once again he made sure the shells matched in color. Then he lowered tortoise number 3 onto Mrs. Silva's balcony. As you will have guessed by now, Mr. Hoppy's secret was a very simple one. If a creature grows slowly enough, I mean very, very slowly indeed, then you'll never notice that it has grown at all, especially if you see it every day. It's the same with children. They are actually growing taller every week, but their mothers never notice it until they grow out of their clothes. Slowly does it, Mr. Hoppy told himself. Don't hurry it. So this is how things went over the next 8 weeks. In the beginning, Alfie weighed 13 ounces. End of first week. Tortoise number 2 weighed 15 ounces. End of second week. Tortoise number 3 weighed 17 ounces. End of third week. Tortoise number 4 weighed 19 ounces. End of fourth week. Tortoise number 5 weighed 21 ounces. Tortoise number 6 weighed 23 ounces. End of sixth week. Tortoise number 7 weighed 25 ounces. End of seventh week. Tortoise number 8 weighed 27 ounces. Alfie's weight was 13 ounces. Tortoise number 8 was 27 ounces. Very slowly, over 7 weeks, Mrs. Silva's pet had more than double in size, and the good lady hadn't noticed a thing. Even to Mr. Hoppy peering down over his railing, Tortoise number 8 looked pretty big. It was amazing that Mrs. Silva had hardly noticed anything at all during that great operation. Only once had she looked up and said, "You know, Mr. Hoppy, I do believe he's getting a bit bigger. What do you think?" "I can't see a lot of difference myself," Mr. Hoppy said. Mr. Hoppy had answered casually. But now perhaps it was time to call a halt, and that evening Mr. Hoppy was just about to go out and suggest to Mrs. Silva that she ought to weigh Alfie when a startled cry from the balcony below brought him outside fast. "Look," Mrs. Silva was shouting, "Alfie's too big to get through the door of his little house. He must have grown enormously." "Weigh him," Mr. Hoppy ordered. "Take him in and weigh him quick." Mrs. Silva did just that, and in half a minute she was back holding the tortoise in both hands and waving it above her head and shouting, "Guess what, Mr. Hoppy? Guess what? He weighs 27 ounces. He's twice as big as he was before." "Oh, you darling," she cried, stroking the tortoise. "Oh, you great big wonderful boy. Just look what clever Mr. Hoppy has done for you." Mr. Hoppy suddenly felt very brave. "Mrs. Silva," he said, "do you think I could pop down to your balcony and hold Alfie myself?" "Why, of course you can," Mrs. Silva cried. "Come down at once." Mr. Hoppy rushed down the stairs and Mrs. Silva opened the door to him. Together they went out onto the balcony. "Just look at him," Mrs. Silva said proudly. "Isn't he grand? He was a big good-sized tortoise now," Mr. Hoppy said. And you did it," Mrs. Silva cried. You're a miracle man, you are indeed. "But what am I going to do about his house?" Mrs. Silva said. "He must have a house to go in at night, but now he can't get through the door." They were standing on the balcony looking at the tortoise who was trying to push his way into his house, but he was too big. "I shall have to enlarge the door," Mrs. Silva said. "Don't do that," Mr. Hoppy said. "You mustn't go tripping up such a pretty little house. After all, he only needs to just a tiny bit smaller, and he could get in easily. How can he possibly get smaller? Mrs. Silva asked. That's simple, Mr. Hoppy said. Change the magic word instead of telling him to get bigger and bigger. Tell him to get a little bit smaller, but in tortoise language, of course. Will that work? Of course it'll work. It'll work. Tell me exactly what I have to say, Mr. Hoppy. Mr. Hoppy got out a piece of paper and a pencil and wrote. Esio Trot, take a tib, relams, a tib, relams. That'll do it, Mrs. Silva, he said, handing her the paper. I don't mind trying it, Mrs. Silva said, but look here, I wouldn't want him to get titchy small all over again. To get titchy small all over again, Mr. Hoppy. He won't, dear lady, he won't, Mr. Hoppy said. Say it only tonight and tomorrow morning, and then see what happens. We might be lucky if it works, Mrs. Silva said, touching him softly on the arm. Then you are the cleverest man alive. The next afternoon, as soon as Mrs. Silva had gone to work, Mr. Hoppy lifted the tortoise up from her balcony and carried it inside. All he had to do now was to find one that was a shade smaller, so that it would just go through the door of the little house. He chose one and lowered it down with his tortoise catcher. Then still gripped the tortoise. He tested it to see if it will go through the door. It wouldn't. He chose another. Again, he tested it. This one went through nicely. Good. He placed the tortoise in the middle of the balcony beside a nice piece of lettuce and went inside to await Mrs. Silva's homecoming. That evening, Mr. Hoppy was watering his plants on the balcony when suddenly he heard Mrs. Silva's shouts from below. Shrill with excitement, Mr. Hoppy, where are you? She was shouting. Just look at this. Mr. Hoppy popped his head over the rail and said, What's up? Oh, Mr. Hoppy, it worked. She was crying. Your magic words have worked again on Alfie. He can now get through his door of his little house. It's a miracle. Can I come down and look? Mr. Hoppy shouted back. Come down at once, my dear man, Mrs. Silva answered. Come down and see the wonders you have worked upon my darling Alfie. Mr. Hoppy turned and ran from the balcony into the living room, jumping on tiptoe like a ballet dancer between the sea of tortoises that covered the floor. He flung open his front door and flew down the stairs 2 at a time, with the love songs of 1,000 cupids ringing his ears. This is it, he whispered to himself under his breath. The greatest moment of my life is coming up now. I mustn't bosh it. I must keep very calm. When he was 3/4 way down the stairs, he caught sight of Mrs. Silva already standing at the open door, waiting to welcome him with a huge smile on her face. She flung her arms around him and cried out, You really are the most wonderful man I've ever met. You can do anything. Come in at once and let me make you a cup of tea. That's the very least you deserve. Seated in a comfortable armchair in Mrs. Silva's parlour, sipping his tea, Mr. Hoppy was all of a twitter. He looked at the lovely lady sitting opposite him and smiled at her. She smiled right back at him. That smile of hers, so warm and friendly, suddenly gave him the courage he needed, and he said, "Mrs. Silva, please will you marry me?" "Why, Mr. Hoppy," she cried, "I didn't think you'd ever get around asking me. Of course I'll marry you." Mr. Hoppy got rid of his teacup, and the two of them stood up and embarrassed warmly in the middle of the room. "It's all due to Alfie," Mrs. Silva said, slightly breathless. "Good old Alfie," Mr. Hoppy said. "We'll keep him forever." The next afternoon, Mr. Hoppy took all his other tortoises back to the pet shop and said they could have them for nothing. Then he cleaned up his living room, leaving not a leaf of cabbage nor a trace of tortoise. A few weeks later, Mrs. Silva became Mrs. Hoppy, and the two of them lived very happily ever after. P.S. I expect you are wondering what happened to little Alfie, the first of them all. Well, he was bought a week later from one of the pet shops by a small girl called Roberta Squibb, and he settled down in Roberta's garden. Every day she fed him lettuce and tomato slices and crispy celery, and in the winters he hibernated in a box of dried leaves in the tool shed. That was a long time ago. Roberta has grown up and is now married and has 2 children of her own. She lives in another house, but Alfie is still with her. Still the much loved family pet, and Roberta reckons that by now he must be about 30 years old. It has taken him all that time to grow twice the size he was when Mrs. Silva had him, but he made it in the end. I hope you like this Roald Dahl book. I'll see you for another one next time. Bye-bye!